Welcome to the Mortarboard, the administrator's source for solutions in higher education. We tell you about challenges other schools have faced, benchmark the problem, share their best practices and epic fails, and invite you to consider whether what worked for them might also work at your institution. Hosted by longtime college president Dr. Dan Barwick, this is the Mortarboard, the source for solutions in higher education.
Welcome to the Mortarboard, your source for solutions in higher education. I'm Dan Barwick. Welcome to the podcast. If the content of this podcast interests you, then you'll enjoy my new book, Risk and Reward: How Small Colleges Get Better Against the Odds. It's now available from Amazon in ebook, paperback, and audiobook format. The best way to find it is to head over to my blog, mortarboardblog.com, and click on the link on the front page. If you have any thoughts about the book, don't hesitate to send me an email and let me know what you think. My guest today is Kevin Carey, Vice President for Education Policy and Knowledge Management at New America. He writes regularly for The Upshot at the New York Times and has written feature articles for Wired, The New Republic, Pacific Standard, Washington Monthly, and other publications. He's a contributing writer for the Chronicle of Higher Education and edits the annual Washington Monthly College Guide. His book, The End of College: Creating the Future of Learning and the University of Everywhere, was published by Riverhead in 2015. Prior to joining New America, Kevin worked as the policy director of Education Sector and as an analyst at the Education Trust and the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. He has also worked for the Indiana Senate Finance Committee and as Indiana's Assistant State Budget Director. Carey has a bachelor's degree from Binghamton University and a master's degree from Ohio State University. He was recently interviewed in Slate magazine in an article entitled, "Master's Degrees Are the Second Biggest Scam in Higher Education." Kevin, welcome to the podcast.
It's great to be here.
Your recent interview in Slate was amazing, and I really don't use that lightly. It was a fairly scathing indictment of two types of programs in higher education. You call these the two biggest scams in higher ed. The second biggest scam being what you called predatory master's degrees, and the biggest one being a credential that partly overlaps with some master's degrees, which is one-year certificate programs from some private colleges. Let's begin with the second worst and build from there, because you're not referring to master's degrees that everyone would look at and say, oh, that's a ripoff. You're talking about degrees being offered by some of the most prestigious institutions in the country. Can you tell us about that and give us some examples?
Yeah, I think that in both cases, these are degree programs that are in some ways marketed to people who are at vulnerable points in their life. You know, they don't know what's next. They have a strong feeling that a credential will help them advance in their career or start in their career. And a trusted institution comes along and says, I have all the answers to your problems. I have a program that's not going to take that long. It's only going to take a year, maybe only 10 months. It's going to be flexible. It'll be designed for you. We'll help you fill out all the financial aid forms, and it will lead directly to a great job. And this is just a promise that isn't kept often. You know, the higher education industry is not really regulated in any strong way around these things by the same government organizations that provide a lot of the financing. And so I think in particular, brand name colleges and universities, you know, your famous institutions, sometimes Ivy League institutions, but also, you know, well-known public universities. What they figured out is that they can maintain very selective admissions on the undergraduate side and reap the benefits of exclusivity that come along with that, and then kind of transfer that prestige over to these master's programs that are distinguished from the undergraduate programs in the sense that they are much less selective in a way that is completely non-transparent to the public. Colleges have to report their admission statistics on the undergraduate side. They don't have to report them for graduate programs. And also, these are programs that can be entirely debt financed. On the undergraduate side, there are pretty narrow limits on how much money people can borrow from the federal government to attend college, whereas there are no limits at all on the graduate side beyond whatever it costs. And of course, colleges can charge whatever they like. So these two things together have just kind of created, I think, an opportunity for colleges to engage in behavior that I think meets the standard of being exploitative. It's taking advantage of the naivete of students, the permissiveness of the federal student loan program in providing programs that don't always live up to these promises. And we saw, a lot of attention around an article that was in the Wall Street Journal a few weeks ago that took advantage of some new federal data. So for the first time, we never knew this before, but for the first time, we know both at the program level how much students are borrowing, but also how much they're making after they finish. And what the authors of that very good piece really zeroed in on programs where there was a lot of debt and very little earnings. They used a MFA in film studies from Columbia as an example, but there, I think, are lots of other examples.
I saw that same article. There is a lot of evidence that these sorts of degrees are of dubious value. Can you talk about why you and others have come to the conclusions that you have?
Well, you just look at the numbers to start with. Again, we didn't have these numbers for a long time, so it was all kind of guesswork. One suspected, based on a lot of it doesn't take much of a conversation with anyone inside academia to have phrase like cash cow appear in proximity to these master's programs. People are very frank about it. They'll say, yeah, we do this to make money. We don't provide any financial aid. We make money here in order to support the PhD programs or the undergraduate mission or whatever it is that we want to support. Don't really make any bones about the fact that these are often not very selective programs from an admission standpoint. Pretty much if you are willing to fill out an application and, sometimes, meet some basic standards, they'll let you in. There's no down consequences for it. Reputational aura for our highest profile institutions is incredibly strong and incredibly durable. And people just assume if a well-known university is offering a program, it must be good.
As bad as you make these common master's programs sound, you've written that the top scam is a more limited variant. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, now I'm referring to for-profit colleges in specifically. I think there is, there's a long and sordid history of terrible abuses by for-profit colleges that has really been bad over the last 20 years, was supercharged by the advent of online education and the ability of people to essentially bring their scamming to scale. But, these are often, I often point to like the whole industry around providing degrees in medical assisting, right? Where get on the subway sometime. And if you have a subway where you are, like, look up, there'll be an ad showing somebody like wearing a lab coat. They look like a nurse usually or a doctor, but usually a nurse. It's this idea that I don't think anyone thinks you can get an MD in a year, but there's this sense that, you can come in and get a job in the medical profession, which people rightly think is very stable and fast growing. And it turns out like medical assisting is not actually a job that requires a credential in the healthcare field. It's sort of kind of being conflated with something like an LPN or an RN, of which there are programs for and are licensing around, and there is a demand for. And you look at the numbers on that, and we've had these numbers for longer because these are mostly programs offered by for-profit colleges, which means they were subject to the Department of Education's gainful employment regulations going back, close to 10 years now under the Obama administration. And so once those regulations were in place, the Department of Education started generating data, and you saw really just horrific numbers where people would come in and borrow, $25,000 for a 9-month program sometimes, whatever the minimum amount of time is necessary to qualify for federal financial aid. And then their average earnings would be like $10,000 a year, less than the minimum wage. Clearly not even working in the field. They couldn't be because if they were, they'd be making more than that. And it shows that, among other things, the market for higher education is very complicated and doesn't work very well. You can't just apply simplistic Econ 101 thinking to how the market for higher education works, in the sense that there will be a balance of supply and demand, and that information and consumer choice will provide quality and discipline to the market. It does not work that way. These are complicated one-time decisions that people made where they have very limited visibility into what they're buying. And if it doesn't work out, it's not like they go back. It's not like, I don't like that coffee shop, I'm going to go to the one up the street. You're in, you're done. It worked out for you or you didn't. And a lot of times these are people who are naive, very vulnerable to marketing, which is why for-profit colleges spend so much money on marketing. And increasingly, so do nonprofit colleges, offering what are essentially, in my mind, for-profit master's programs just owned by nonprofit colleges.
Well, it's funny. I would say not a day goes by that I don't receive multiple solicitations in my email from colleges, some for-profit, some not, that want me to go get additional credentials there. Even, I have a terminal degree, but they want me to get more. And then on occasion, I'll look in my spam folder and I discover that actually what makes it to my eyeballs in my regular inbox is actually just the tip of the iceberg.
Not even the bad stuff.
Yeah. And when I look at these, they have two things in common. The first is that they're somewhat vague. The second is that they're all online. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how the growth of online is affecting either of the two degree types that you've talked about so far.
It's had a major effect. And I want to pause for a minute and just make a point that I didn't make in that Slate article, but it's worth making just to be clear. Not all master's degrees are scams. Most of them aren't, just in case there's any confusion on that. I have a master's degree. I have a master's degree in public administration. It was a good 2-year program from a public university, Ohio State University, that I think was worth the money and absolutely, gave me the both theoretical and practical experience I needed to start a career in public service. So it's a big, wide universe of credentials, and we're only talking about some of them. Absolutely, the internet has had a big effect on the market. I'm not a reflexive critic of online education at all. I wrote a whole book about online education a few years ago that's very enthusiastic about it, and particularly graduate students who often have jobs, particularly master's students, often people who are they're working full time, they have families, they have children. Online provides a lot of flexibility. These can be very good programs. At the same time, online education provided more of an opportunity for scale, which can mean more of an opportunity for profits, which can just add to the incentives for institutions to make choices that I think are arguably unethical in the way that they choose to market and set prices. And really, in a lot of cases, have blurred the distinction between for-profit and nonprofit almost to the point of being meaningless. I've written a lot about the industry and online program managers, which I imagine many of the listeners here are familiar with. But these are for-profit corporations that enter into agreements with often very prestigious nonprofit colleges and universities, where they do most of the work on the back end in terms of creating online, mostly graduate programs, all of the marketing, all of the recruitment, a lot of the quote counseling around loans, all of the online infrastructure. And in some cases, they get 70% of the tuition revenue in return. And if you look at how these companies spend their money, and there are a couple that are publicly traded, and so you can find this information, the spending profile is very similar to for-profit colleges in the sense they spend way more money on marketing than on instruction. So, you'll have a program that's costing maybe $45,000 a year, and $15,000 of that $45,000 all told was the cost of recruiting, advertising, bringing that student in, and then maybe there's an adjunct professor somewhere who got paid $5,000 or something like that. I mean, it's not even close. And yet there's still money left over for profits on both sides. So, oftentimes because the OPMs spend more, that 70% of the revenue translates into about half of the net revenue. So there are still healthy profits for the OPM and for the university. Often it's the department that's sponsoring the program. Who's nonprofit and who's for-profit in that situation? I think everybody's for-profit. And I think that, I'm not someone who thinks that any for-profit organization is, should be looked down on or anything. But I do think that they have different motives and needed to be regulated in different ways. And I think that'll be a topic of discussion as the Biden administration takes a harder look at some of these things over the next couple of years.
When you mention who's for-profit and who's not for-profit, one of the things that occurs to me is it feels as if somehow the normal pattern is changing. So when I was younger, and I hate saying things like that because I feel pretty old when I say that, but when I was younger, the general formula was that universities, large universities, were basically offering undergraduate instruction in ways that funded graduate instruction. For example, a lot of the larger undergraduate classes were taught, by teaching assistants rather than professors. And this was all just sort of part of the equation. It was that general education that was fueling everything else. And it sounds like what you're describing is a real change from that.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, universities are just always looking for cheap labor. And before the internet, the cheapest labor you could find was a graduate TA standing in front of 500 students somewhere, right?
Yeah, I was one of those ones,
right? And so that was the model, and you make your financial assumptions and you make your decisions that way. Now, the cheapest labor might be somebody who's actually credentialed. There's certainly no undersupply of people with academic credentials in the academic labor market, and instead of standing in a room with 400 students, they might be online with 1,000 students, effectively in terms of what the ratios we're talking about, because a lot of the teaching and the education and the learning isn't a synchronous dialogue between people. It's different approaches to education that are much more kind of instantiated in technology. And again, I want to emphasize that's not necessarily bad. There are we're now several decades into developing and improving online learning. There are thousands of full-time professionals in our colleges and universities that work very hard at making these courses good, and we're still learning a lot. But at scale, the financial numbers really started to change and become pretty dramatic.
Yeah, you remind me that when I referred to the way it used to be done, graduate school was not as expensive as it is now. In other words, they didn't necessarily talk about graduate programs as cash cows. Everybody's sort of familiar with the way the cost of tuition at the undergraduate level has reliably exceeded inflation for years and years and years. But I believe you actually pointed out in the Slate article that if you want to see where there's real explosion in cost, my recollection is that, you pointed out it's at the graduate level. You pointed out that somebody, for example, who has hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt did not acquire that as an undergraduate.
Yeah, in federal debt, it's essentially impossible to do that. And I think I made this point, but if you look at there are many more individual people who borrow money to get undergraduate degrees. But if you look at the volume of debt, close to half of all federal dollars that are dispersed for loans are for graduate degrees, because they're so much more expensive, and again, there's no limit on how much you can borrow, and a lot of that debt is now being funneled into income-driven loan repayment programs, with hopefully the possibility of debt forgiveness in 20 years or 10 years if you take a public service job. But when you hear these kind of aggregate statistics that have just become, kind of part of the vernacular of how we discuss higher education, I think once aggregate debt crossed $1 trillion, that number was just going to be, in the conversation forever. We're up to 1.7 trillion or whatever it is now. But a lot of that is graduate debt. And so it's important to understand, because I think when, the general public hears this conversation and they hear student loans, they think undergraduate. And they might be concerned that people are borrowing $200,000 to get a bachelor's degree. Very few people are doing that. You have to go into the private loan market to take out those kind of loans. There's really kind of a bifurcation inside the student loan crisis, where you have kind of distinct populations. Some of them are people like those described in that Wall Street Journal article, where somebody just borrowed way too much money to get a master's degree that is not going to lead to a job that will allow them to pay it back. Then you have this other big population of students who actually didn't borrow that much money, maybe $10,000, $15,000, $20,000, but they borrowed it for the first scammiest degree, right? The for-profit degree, or they dropped out. There's a huge population of people who enroll and just don't finish. So they have nothing to show for it. They're worse off than when they started. But of course, they still have the loan.
To continue along that line of thought, you pointed out that part of what has fueled the growth of programs like these, and of course the attendant costs, are federal borrowing laws. Can you take us through that?
Well, there was a change to federal borrowing law back in 2005. It was not noticed very much at the time. It was part of a bigger package of changes to student loan laws, which removed the cap on how much money you could borrow from the federal government to go to graduate school. It created this program called the Grad PLUS program. And, again, back in 2005, we still had mostly a bank-based federal student loan program. And so that was what, everyone in DC was still wrangling with, how to get like Sallie Mae and out of the system. And I'm old enough to remember when Sallie Mae was like the great villain of student loans. And that, that's not really the world we live in anymore. I mean, that hasn't been true since 2010. So now it's 11 years later, and the federal government just lends all the money directly. But I think so. You had essentially unlimited borrowing for graduate programs appear at exactly the same time the internet allowed graduate programs to get bigger, and at the tail end of the great enrollment expansion. The peak of the millennial generations move into higher education at the undergraduate level happened, I think, in 2008, 2009, a few years later. And now we're down like 1.5 million students from the peak. So this kind of long secular decline in enrollment really put the financial squeeze on a lot of institutions, which maybe had built up infrastructure or cost basis or whatever. And then the Great Recession happened a couple of years later too, which means if you were a public institution, your state funding, definitely got squeezed. Sometimes it came back, sometimes it didn't. What all of that did was sent more and more university administrators back to the drawing board looking for revenue. And then all of a sudden there was the solution, and so that I think has created the incentive structure that has led us to where we are today.
Let's talk about solutions. In your view, what should be done to fix these problems?
I would say a couple of things. I think there have to be some limits on federal lending for graduate school. I know that's a tough pill to swallow. And maybe there are different ways to think about how to do that. Maybe we start making distinctions by program. MDs borrow enormous amounts of money, but generally they're able to pay it back. On the other hand, people who go to vet school also borrow MD amount of money, and then they have a horrible time paying it back because there's a lot more money in treating people than in treating dogs and cats. But I think some kind of limit on both how much money you can borrow to go to graduate school and also how much of your loans can be forgiven. Right now, we have essentially a non-functioning loan forgiveness apparatus at the federal level, but I don't think that's going to last forever. I think eventually people are going to kind of figure out these overly complicated systems, and we're going to see kind of eye-popping loan forgiveness amounts. People who are having $200,000 or $300,000 in loans forgiven, and I think as soon as that happens, people are going to raise their hand and say, wait a minute, we have to fight tooth and nail to increase the maximum Pell Grant from like $5,500 to $5,800. So, over the course of an undergraduate career, maybe, $25,000 for the lowest income students. We're giving $200,000 to people who went to graduate school and in some cases might have, good jobs. They might be lawyers or doctors and something like that. That doesn't make a lot of sense. So I think
Kevin, just to clarify, who is it that you think is going to raise their hand and say that?
Who's going to raise their hand and say what?
That, wait a second, you want to forgive all these loans, but we had to struggle so hard to increase Pell Grants.
I think that, there is essentially like a criticism in waiting for the loan forgiveness apparatus once it actually starts to work. It's not working now. And so this is a little bit hypothetical. But I certainly think people, probably Republicans more than Democrats, are going to be pretty skeptical of the idea of windfall levels of loan forgiveness once those things start to actually work their way through the system.
What motivated my question was actually I was wondering if you thought that line of argument was a sort of an excuse by people who would not normally be particularly interested in increasing Pell Grant amounts.
Oh, sure. They might not actually want to increase Pell Grant amounts. It might be a comparison of convenience. Maybe they just really don't want to spend money on graduate school. And that's the thing too. We're in the the strong, long-standing bipartisan consensus, and it really has been a bipartisan consensus around public support for higher education, I think is fracturing right now. And it has a lot to do with politics. It wasn't that long ago, and by that I mean 10, 15 years ago, when there wasn't a strong correlation between your education level and whether you were a Democrat or a Republican. And that is no longer true. In fact, and particularly if you look at the margins where a lot of the movement has been over the last 5, 10 years, and the Trump presidency kind of really being, gasoline on the fire, but essentially, particularly among white voters, white college-educated Republicans are becoming Democrats, and white non-college educated Democrats are becoming Republicans, which means all of a sudden you now only have one party whose voters have a financial and kind of cultural interest in the higher education system. I think that is a real risk, and I think that's something that is going to be a challenge to contend with going forward.
That's actually just as an aside, that's a totally fascinating point. The idea that public support for education is waning or maybe about to wane in some way. I think if you look at the total volume of news around the subject, you might come away with just the opposite impression. If you think about the amount of conversation about free college, whether it's the result of government action or private action, I noticed just today that Walmart issued a press release saying that they would provide tuition for their employees that want to go to college, or the discussion about, for example, at the other end of the educational age spectrum, if you look at the debate over pre-K, all of these conversations, I'm not sure that they were occurring, at least in the intensity they're occurring now. I'm not sure they were occurring this way 5, 10 years ago.
I think that's right. But it has been driven, only by one political party, right? I mean, so on the one hand, it was amazing to see how free college and debt forgiveness went from being, pretty marginal ideas, maybe just one kind of goofy senator from Vermont who was really out in front of them, to becoming table stakes for running for president, the Democratic Party's nomination for president in the last election. But at the same time, it hasn't happened yet. And I don't think that the Biden administration, I feel pretty confident saying the Biden administration is not where Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren are when it comes to debt forgiveness. They have proposed, what would be an historic new federal investment in bringing tuition down, but only for community colleges, not for the entire system, not for the whole apparatus of public four-year institutions. So, kind of more moderate. I suppose the Overton window is really shifted over in terms of what qualifies as moderate when it comes to investing. Again, that's one party, though. Whereas if you look at something like the Pell Grant program, even in times when Republicans have taken power and been interested in cutting federal programs, they've never cut the Pell Grant program. And partly that's because there's a college or university in almost every congressional district in the country, and those are always, regardless of ideology, institutions that are pretty well looked on and relied upon.
Now, I apologize. I've taken us on an interesting sidetrack, but I did interrupt your answer about the kinds of solutions that we need to provide.
Sure. So I would say, two big things. One, as I said, some limits on borrowing. I think unlimited borrowing creates kind of a moral hazard when it comes to pricing and marketing these programs. I don't think we can rely on merely the market and the sound judgment of borrowers when it comes to preventing overborrowing and predatory pricing. The other thing is we need to hold these programs accountable. And I'm talking just about master's programs now. I actually would be a lot less comfortable taking this approach for bachelor's programs, because I do think bachelor's programs are more universal. We expect that people get bachelor's degrees. They're not just there to prepare for a job. They're there to prepare for a life and to be exposed to different kinds of learning. And I don't think we want to kind of narrowly prescribe how we think about what success is like for a bachelor's degree education. Master's programs are job programs. If they don't lead to some kind of job, they shouldn't be putting students in enormous amounts of debt. I mean, I'm pretty comfortable saying that. They are pretty much for-profit programs, whether they happen to be run at a nonprofit university or not. So I would use the same measures that we use for-profit programs for master's programs. The same measure implicitly that was in that Wall Street Journal article we talked about, the same measure that the Obama administration used for its gainful employment regulation, which is how much are students borrowing and how much are they earning? And if that ratio is wildly out of whack, if people are just borrowing way more money than the jobs they subsequently get allow them to pay it back, I don't think that the public should be in the business of propping up those programs with student loans that are very easy to get. You don't need to, other than just kind of a basic lack of bad credit, you don't need to show that you have any assets or ability to repay these loans. And which again creates more risk and more danger for students. So I think we need to regulate master's programs around debt and earnings numbers just to create some limits on what seem like programs that are currently kind of out of control.
Kevin Carey is the Vice President for Education Policy and Knowledge Management at New America. Kevin, thanks very much for being with us today.
Thanks for inviting me. It's been great.
Thanks for joining me. Please feel free to email me with questions, comments, or suggestions for content that you'd like to hear about. You can reach me at mortarboardpodcast@gmail.com. Consider stopping by my blog, mortarboardblog.com. The blog contains links to stories that I think will interest you, podcast transcripts, and articles I've written. You can also like me on Facebook at Dr. Daniel Barwick or follow me on Twitter at Daniel Barwick. Looking forward to talking with you in the next episode.